It's one of the most haunting stories in aviation history. A Boeing 737, a silent crew, unconscious passengers, and a fighter pilot powerless to do anything but watch as the ghostly aircraft drifted towards disaster. This is the story of Helios Airways Flight 522, the ghost flight that left the skies above Greece frozen in terror, as 121 souls on board slipped away without a sound. August 14, 2005 began like any other day at Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. Helios Airways Flight 522 was ready for takeoff, with 115 passengers and 6 crew members on board, bound for Prague with a quick stop in Athens. The skies were clear, the morning bright, and as the plane climbed into the sky, everything seemed routine. But 15 minutes after takeoff, something went wrong. Very wrong. An air conditioning warning light blinked on in the cockpit, and the pilots contacted ground control reporting the issue. What they didn't realize was that this would be their last communication. The true disaster had already begun. Flight 522 climbed higher, but inside the cabin, the air was growing thin. The oxygen levels dropped slowly but steadily, and without anyone noticing, hypoxia set in. A silent, invisible killer. The pilots were still at the controls, but their minds were slipping away. On the ground in Athens, air traffic control tried to reach the aircraft, but there was no response. Again and again, their calls went unanswered. Hours passed, and the plane was still flying, circling aimlessly over the Greek capital. It was as if everyone on board had vanished into thin air. Fighter jets were scrambled. The Greek military feared the worst. Was this a hijacking? A terrorist attack? But when the pilots approached the plane, what they found was far more chilling. Through the cockpit window, they could see the first officer, slumped over the controls, motionless. The captain's seat was empty. And in the cabin, the passengers were eerily still, their oxygen masks hanging uselessly in front of their faces. All of them were alive, but unconscious, trapped in a nightmare from which they would never wake. Inside the cabin, the passengers were still in their seats, motionless. Oxygen masks hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the stillness, but they were useless. Every single passenger was unconscious, their heads slumped to one side, their limbs heavy. It looked like they were sleeping, only their faces were too pale, their chests barely rising and falling. The fighter pilots' hearts raced. They circled the aircraft, calling for any sign of life, but the plane just drifted. It was like watching the dead fly. A ghost plane, haunted by souls who didn't know they were already gone. But then, there was movement. In the middle of that cabin full of death, one man was moving. A flight attendant, Andreas Prodromou, was still alive, stumbling through the aisle, gasping for air. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was a trained pilot, but not for a plane like this, and he was running out of time. His hands shook as he reached the cockpit, trying to take control. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tried to communicate with the fighter jets circling outside. They watched helplessly as he fumbled with the controls, trying desperately to save them all, but it was too late. Prodromou, weak from the lack of oxygen, his mind fogging up, pointed out the window to the fighter pilots. His hand moved slowly, shaking uncontrollably. He was trying to tell them something, anything, but they couldn't understand. All they could do was watch as he fought against the inevitable, his body failing him, his mind slipping away. Seconds felt like hours. He tried to pull the plane out of its death spiral, but his movements were sluggish, his vision blurred. It was like watching a man drown in slow motion, each breath weaker than the last. Then the engines began to fail. 6 o'clock, the final moments. One engine gave out, then the other. The plane, now a gliding corpse, was falling. Slowly, silently, it descended towards the mountains outside Athens. The fighter pilots could only watch. Their hands gripped the controls, their hearts pounding. But there was nothing they could do. Prodromou was still there, in the cockpit, his hand weakly pulling at the yoke, his body trembling as the plane dropped. He was trying to save them, but he was too far gone. His body was alive, but his mind was already dead. The last thing he did was look out the window. His eyes met those of the fighter pilot just for a moment, and then 7 o'clock, the crash. The plane slammed into the mountainside, a deafening explosion of metal and fire. In that moment, 121 lives were extinguished. The fighter pilots circled above, the flames from the wreckage lighting up the darkening sky. The radio went silent. There were no survivors. 7:30, the aftermath, a haunting legacy. The investigation that followed revealed the grim truth. A simple mistake, a switch left in the wrong position, had caused the plane to lose cabin pressure. Hypoxia claimed them all, silently and without mercy. The passengers, the crew, even the brave Andreas Prodromou, none of them stood a chance. But the most chilling part. For nearly 3 hours, that plane drifted in the skies, a ghost ship in the clouds, its passengers already dead to the world, and all the while no one could stop it. Helios Flight 522 will forever be remembered as the ghost flight. A plane filled with the living dead, doomed to crash as helpless eyes watched from above. Some say that the mountains where Flight 522 crashed are haunted. That at night, if the wind blows just right, you can still hear the distant hum of engines, the soft, whispering breaths of those lost souls drifting through the clouds. Thank you for watching. If this story chilled you, don't forget to like and share. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, sometimes the scariest part of a story is the silence that hides within.